first, there is a new trend among the more disturbed elements of radicals out there, which involves tearing down the posters of hostages being held by Hamas. 240 hostages are estimated to be trapped by these evil terrorists in Gaza, and it is a cold, hard fact you seldom hear from those asking Israel to stop moving forward with the ground invasion. In fact, the reality of that horror is so contrary to the narrative pro-Hamas figures want to push, they are trying to remove all evidence of these hostages from public. Take a look at what has happened here on the streets of New York.
Please stop ripping posters down. These are innocent civilians in Israel.
You, Israel.
What? You. These are our members. We have family.
You. Talk that way, my sister. You. And Israel.
Don't down these posters.
In that propaganda.
Well, there are similar videos surfacing in Western countries all over the world. So how has the media reacted? Not a shred of decency. The New York Post splashed the faces of these women on the front of the paper yesterday, and the Twitter post alone has already been viewed more than 13.1 million times. It was a brilliant front page which cast a spotlight directly on the extraordinary cultural issues we face in Western countries. It was a paper saying, no, that is a line we do not cross in this city. And predictably, when many anti-Israeli activists looked at that front page, it didn't trigger any contrition. It didn't cause them to pause and think perhaps we shouldn't attempt to erase the existence of hostages from the public. Now, here's a few of the top comments on the New York Post's tweet. How much is the Israeli government paying for the New York Post? This is deplorable. You should be ashamed for exposing them to such danger. You're disgusting, and you will be remembered in history for your support and contribution to evil and genocide. Public shaming, New York Post illegally publishing their photos. That puts their lives in danger. Now, these women stood in public, arrogantly ripping down the posters of people going through hell to hide their stories and to hide their horror. But when the reality of their actions is captured on camera and then reported on, well, it's all just the fault of the media, isn't it? Because the media exposed the reality of their actions. Now, if you don't have the courage or the integrity to stand by what you do in public, maybe don't do it. The world sees them now, and that is probably a terrifying thought, as deep down they have to know how repugnant a decision it was to remove the posters. Well done to the Post for drawing a hard line in the sand. And perhaps next time an activist wants to rip down a poster hung by a grieving family member, they will remember the shame of these two women. Perhaps they will remember that outside of their niche social circles, mainstream people find this behaviour reprehensible. Well, joining me on the show this week is Sky News host Caleb Bond and Sky News host Caroline DeRusso. Caleb, let's start with you. Thanks for joining us on the desk.
Pleasure.
These videos, they're popping up everywhere. We've seen a similar one in Bondi, which has resulted in 2 people being charged. We've seen them in Canada. We've seen them in the UK. Why is this happening? Why would someone want to tear down a poster?
Well, because they're an anti-Semite is the first answer. But the reason that people have felt comfortable to be able to do this kind of thing started with more or less what happened on the steps of the Opera House nearly 3 weeks ago now. Because once we had a line in the sand that basically said you could go and stand on the steps of the Opera House and shout "Gas the Jews," well, it was on for young and old, and it has been on for young and old since then. And that's why it is important for these events to be reported on without fear or favour. Now, certain sections of the media haven't done that. Certain sections of the media seem to have sympathised with Hamas and bought Hamas's propaganda, particularly when it came to that blast near a hospital in Gaza. You know, Hamas came straight out and said, oh, well, it was an Israeli bombing. And a lot of the media just picked that up and ran with it, which was totally irresponsible to do.
Well, we all got it wrong. It came through on the wires and it was everywhere.
It was totally irresponsible to do because, of course, Israel being a democratic nation that sort of gets its ducks in a row before it makes any statements, actually went and investigated what had happened before it said anything. So in that regard, Hamas begins to win the news war because they just put out whatever they want when whenever they want, and people picked it up. So that's why it is important that events like these have to be reported on. And the stuff you showed there with the reaction, oh, how dare you report on it? I mean, for heaven's sake, it's not illegal. If you're doing something in public, it's quite legal to film you. But people don't want what they do to be reported on. Now, if that is your reaction, that, oh, how dare you report on this, maybe you ought to question why you did it in the first place. If you're upset that people know that you did it, why did you do it in the first place?
Yeah, it's such a good point. And Caroline, let's bring you into this now as well, because the role that the New York Post played in this and sharing this photo and effectively by putting a story on the front page, you're saying, today, this is the biggest issue our city faces. A lot of people in the comments were saying, oh, well, this isn't important enough. You're bullying these women. What do you make of it? Was it the right call by the Post?
I think so. And particularly a city like New York, it does have a huge Jewish population. So I'm sure for residents of that city, they would be comforted to know that the media isn't all one side on these things. And the thing that I find, the morbid irony about people criticising, oh, well, what about these people and their safety? These are the Words of Violence Brigade. And the Words of Violence Brigade have absolutely no qualms when it comes to civilian people being held hostage in another country. So when they call for ceasefire and they don't talk about hostages, or they talk about one set of civilians but not the other set of civilians, you can really see the way that narrative is being shaped one way or the other. We should be talking about everything that is happening, because all of those objective facts are important to the story. Unfortunately, in so many places in the media, things like hostages are just not talked about. They don't even make a bottom line somewhere. So the fact that these posters are out reminding the public that there are over 200 people being held hostage in Gaza who, prior to the 7th of October, were just getting about their daily lives, who are not military, who are not in any way, shape or form, just getting on with things, that reminder needs to be had. The fact that people want to remove that reminder tells you everything you need to know.
Now, Caleb, I also want to get your reaction to some footage of an ingenious way that Israeli supporters are getting around people tearing down their posters. Let's take a look. Caleb, obviously you made the right point that the New York Post is highlighting this as an issue. That's another clip where we're seeing people doing these things. It's crazy, isn't it?
Well, see, the great thing about that there is the people who own that building, in response to the fact that people have been ripping down posters, decided that they would project the photograph of the hostages onto the side of the building because there was no way you could remove that.
Brilliant.
And you see the footage there of them waving the Israeli flag and standing around singing. And that's why, again, the reporting is important, because in those moments, if you are a Jewish person right now, and I've been receiving messages for weeks from viewers of the late debate saying, I am Jewish and I have never felt so unsafe in my life. And how sad that in the West, we are at a point where people who are probably some of the most oppressed people on earth, certainly in recent memory. I mean, you've only got to go back to Nazi Germany, and there are people living today who were around in Nazi Germany, people who are survivors of the Holocaust. And to be having to go through that again, the reporting of the New York Post and the actions that we saw there just send that message that we stand with you. And I think that's incredibly important at this time, particularly when you see people basically unfettered, allowed to go around shouting anti-Semitic chants like "from the river to the sea" on the streets of major cities like London and Sydney and New York without any repercussions.
I think a big part of it as well is part of the reason people are calling for a ceasefire is getting around the fact that they are trying to get these hostages back home. So if there are no hostages, that argument becomes a lot more solid. So they're just pretending it doesn't exist.